Right, welcome to the ACEMS mentoring seminar. I'm not sure whether we should even call this mentoring because it's a little bit of a, it's certainly good career advice, but it's also good advice in a technical sense. And we're extremely lucky to have as a speaker today Professor Ian Gordon, who's the director of the Statistical Consulting Centre here at University of Melbourne. I don't know how long Ian's been director of the SEC. He was already when I arrived in 2002. So how long do you date back, Ian?
It goes back to 1991, believe it or not.
Right, so he's got plenty of experience. So Ian, take it away.
For better or for worse. Thanks, Peter. So my task today is to talk about doing mathematical and statistical consulting. I do have a poll up here, and one person's been enterprising enough to respond to it, which is great. If you've got access to a browser or a mobile phone, you should be able to tick A, B, C or D. And I might just give a couple of minutes for people to do that if they're interested, just to find out who we've got listening to me today. So these express various attitudes to doing mathematical or statistical consulting. And you might say, well, none of these capture exactly my attitude. And that just shows that this is a poor question and needs more work in a survey sense. But I guess most people would fit into some of these categories. I've got 3 responses so far. Yeah, so maybe you don't do any, never have, or you don't do much at all, but you're sort of interested in knowing a little bit more about it, curious about it. And it's obviously true that it's not everybody's cup of tea. And some people should go through their whole career without doing much because they're better suited to other things. Maybe you've done some and you'd like to do more. When I started doing some statistical consulting, it was a very attractive thing to me because it really did seem to allow the application of interesting methods and techniques and so on to real problems, to problems that people really wanted to deal with. Maybe you've done some and you don't think it's your thing, so you might have learned from bitter experience perhaps. And maybe you're in the last category, in which case if somebody ticks that, I might just sit down and get them to come up here if they're in the room.
There's a big gap between C and D.
Yeah, sure. I'll just leave it there for a minute more to say that, of course, I've done a lot of statistical consulting, and I'll say a bit about my experience in a sec. But funnily enough, my very first substantial experience consulting was strictly mathematical, and I'll tell you what it was. It was a job for the Australian Wheat Board. They probably still do, have silos with various geometries with respect to the way that the grains fall into the silos. So the storage facilities are often have some regularity with respect to their geometry, but they don't always drop the wheat in, so to speak, the centre of the cone, and they sometimes have intersecting cylinders. And they had some technical people at the Wheat Board who'd worked out formulae for the volume of the wheat when they had a given, height of the wheat in the storage container. And they sort of realised that they didn't seem right. They were uneasy about it. It sort of didn't gel with the expectations of the experts in terms of the volumes. And so they consulted me then, this is, 40 years ago, about the formulae. So it was a very mathematical thing, and it was sort of mildly complicated because of this issue of intersecting geometries. You had to think about the whole issue, but it was strictly mathematical. So that's where I started, but I rapidly went into statistical consulting much more. So we've got 8 responses here. Time we saw what people have said. So let's show the results here. Okay, so nobody wants to give the seminar, all right. Oh, that's an encouraging result from a speaker's point of view in terms of what I'm going to talk about. Okay, so let me go to my presentation. I'm asked to talk about these topics today, how to do mathematical and statistical consulting and so on. I should say at the outset that I'm not going to fulfill this brief completely, so you're going to be sold short. I'm going to talk about several of these things, but not all of them in a lot of detail, some of them in some detail. In particular, I'm not going to talk about more of the commercial aspects. Now you might think, well, that's a shame because that's what I really wanted to find out about. Well, there is this thing called the Trade Secrets Act, for one thing, And if you read that, it's a little bit scary about what you're allowed to discuss with people who may be competing with you for business in terms of discussing such things as even rates and various contractual arrangements. If people are interested, I can talk a little bit more about how the contractual arrangements and negotiations about money and so on work in my environment, but they can be a little bit contextual. It varies from situation to situation. But I'm certainly going to talk about the first interview and doing the work and report writing. I'll talk about those things in some detail. You may think by the end of this seminar, well, that was a bunch of common sense that was perfectly obvious. If that's the case, I think you're probably well suited to consulting. You might be a natural. It's just proven by experience that not everybody gets that common sense. And so I think it can be useful for some people who don't see it straight away or don't sort of think about these issues much to just be provided with a bit of structure to think about how to do this kind of work. And I think some of it does apply to other aspects of work as an academic or even more generally. So a little bit of personal history. I've seen from the previous mentoring seminars that this is a sort of standard thing to do. I am a statistician. If somebody asks me what, to define me as briefly as I can, I'd say I'm a statistician. These days I'm perfectly happy to say I'm also a data scientist, but at heart I'm a statistician doing statistical consulting and also mainstream academic work. So I have not far off a full teaching load and I supervise students and I write papers. The one thing I don't do so much is get competitive research grants. In our university, generally, of course, now there's these categories of grants and categories of income, and a lot of our income now comes in the categories 2 and 3 of the classification under consulting. My background's in mathematical statistics. I did work in another environment as an applied statistician, namely epidemiology, and that's not an unusual thing, and it's probably a helpful thing often for people to work a little bit outside the mainstream discipline of statistics or mathematics for that matter, for a while when they're young, applying their trade, so to speak. But since then, I've worked in the Statistical Consulting Centre at the University of Melbourne for a long time as its director. So I haven't formally done the sums, but I think if I try and do that honestly, I've worked on over 1,000, I think it's between 1,000 and 2,000 projects entailing statistical assistance. Now that varies from everything from helping a research student, a higher degree research student with possibly a small amount of statistical assistance to something that might go for several years and everything in between. That assistance is provided in the Consulting Centre and now the Melbourne Statistical Consulting platform to a variety of clients. So we have external clients in business, government and industry, and we have internal, we refer to them as internal clients. It just means within the university, staff and research higher degree students. PhD students is the model. So we don't help master's students who are doing masters by coursework. It more or less happens naturally, I think, that you get some kind of personal emphasis and focus in your work, much as people do in research. And while it is true that if you work in an outfit like the Statistical Consulting Centre, you have to become a generalist. And so I've done all kinds of things that are sort of outside my comfort zone, including, working in time series and education and all kinds of things. But I do have a personal focus, I think, on, there's a typo, I'm sorry about that, on medicine and epidemiology and methods within those, particularly meta-analysis and survival analysis. And also, and sometimes these overlap, expert witness work. So I've done quite a lot of work in the court system, providing expert witness evidence as a statistician. Okay, so let's talk about the consulting session. So I'm going to talk quite a bit about, if you like, the first interview. And of those 1,000+ projects, the overwhelming majority would have a first personal interview. Not all of them. Sometimes it's done remotely, particularly if the client's interstate, and sometimes it might only involve a phone call, but I'd say the very great majority, perhaps more than 90%, would involve a one-to-one or one-to-many interaction to start things off. It's very, very common and good. It's good that that happens, I think. So when you're working as a statistician, generally in consulting or otherwise, you're often going to have this kind of human interaction with a client. So who is that? Well, it might be the client in the straightforward sense, in the straightforward consulting sense, the person that you are working with and for to assist customer with the research need. But it also could be these other kinds of people, you know, someone you're working with in a collegial sense, collaborator, could even be a supervisor or a boss. It could be one-to-one or one-to-many. Well, think about that. If you're entering a situation with a professional and you're the client, what works well when you first meet the professional? When you first meet the doctor, the lawyer, the architect, the accountant, the counsellor for that matter. Because that's what's happening when we're working as a consultant. Someone's coming in or we're going to them, whichever way around it is, and we're having a personal encounter for the first time. And there are all sorts of things going on in people's minds about expectations about professional help that they're going to get. And we're sometimes in that category, around the other way. So it's useful to think of what helps at the start. Well, one of the things that might help is the physical arrangements of the furniture. Okay, that may not occur to you straight away. But if you have a round table, that's a different dynamic from a square table where you're sitting opposite or even at right angles. A round table gives a sense of sort of conducive to sharing, to a collaboration, to not being too sort of confrontational. But even other such things as whether the furniture is arranged in a way that sort of feels accommodating and friendly. Welcoming attitude, somewhat formal approach initially. Now, some of these things I think are very much a matter of style, and different personalities can get away with quite different approaches. But if you're sort of don't know what style to use, then I think using a somewhat formal approach initially, not ultra formal, because that's not the kind of society we're in, but somewhat formal will be perfectly acceptable. And other practical things like punctuality and so on are important, particularly for first meetings and so on. What can go wrong here? Well, you know, an email comes in and you get distracted and look at your computer. That would be a very bad thing to do. I've seen it done. Okay, where the consultant or the person who's really required to give attention to the person in their room gets distracted by something routine. Phone, email, knock on the door. Knock on the door you can't do much about. You can certainly ignore a phone, switch it off, or ignore it if it's a landline that rings. All those things can contribute in a negative or a positive way to the encounter. So lack of warmth or care, if you're just clinical about things, that won't do work very well either. Perhaps more subtly, I mean, you might say a lot of those things are kind of obvious, but, well, okay, they're obvious, but they're still important. But perhaps a little bit more subtly is when you may have a mismatch between your expectations for what you're going to achieve and the client's expectations. So the client comes with perhaps the thought that you're going to have a 2.5-hour meeting where you're going to get through a stack of stuff and solve a lot of problems, and you don't have that amount of time in the first place, and you want to have a discussion about the nature of the project. Let's say that's a simple version of the mismatch of expectations. Well, how can you deal with that? Well, one way to deal with that, I'm probably going to say it later, is to explicitly address it. You know, what are your expectations for today? And that could have been negotiated before the meeting anyway. So you can have a chat. Sort of sussing that out is a good thing to do, to find out, just to make sure that in the first meeting, the purposes of the meeting are roughly aligned between you and the client. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about types of intelligences. So this comes from work by someone called Gardner, who's a cognitive psychologist. And again, some of these people are quite intuitive about, I think, in a good way. So they deal with it well. But if it hasn't occurred to you or you're blind to it, then I think it can be useful to realise and to get some insights. What is this all about? It's saying that we learn things, we come to sort of understand them, we take in information in a variety of ways. Everybody does. And we have different preferences. one thing, it's useful to see what the range of possibilities are there, but also to be aware of your own strengths and weaknesses in communication and understanding, the styles that you prefer, and the possible styles that a client may be preferring. So here's the simplest one, I think, simplest distinction. There's more to it than this, but this is a very obvious and simple one. And there's one more that will occur to you in a second. Between verbal and sort of, if you like, logical or mathematical. Gardner actually uses this term, logical mathematical, as one of the types of intelligences. So here you're expressing sort of roughly the same thing in two different ways, one via an equation and one via words. And it's simply true that some people are just spooked by, you know, mathematical equations. So if you say, start to explain something and write down an equation, some people are just, you know, their anxiety levels are immediately starting to be raised. They think, oh, I'm not going to understand. So I knew I should, you know, I knew I was coming to see a statistician. I should have been better prepared. I should have read a book before I came. I should have seen my friend in the pub because, you know, I know her and she won't talk to me like this. And that's been going on in their head now for 5 minutes. They haven't taken in anything that you've said. They've just got more and more anxious. Now, I'm exaggerating, but not that much, honestly. Some people really are like that. Whereas if you've used a verbal method, they may be perfectly comfortable with that. Now, I mean, you know, we're talking here about a range of clients, and some clients, of course, have strong backgrounds mathematically and statistically even, and strong technical capacity. So some clients are not going to be intimidated by this at all. But I'm just pointing out the variation. The other big one, of course, is visual. And you really notice that strongly. Some people, when you start talking to clients, some people can't help themselves. They'll grab the piece of paper that you're taking notes on, grab it for themselves, get out their pen and instantly draw a diagram. I don't mean a representation of data necessarily, but a flow chart or some spatial representation of the way they think. Some people just think in diagrams the whole time, a lot. Something to be aware of. You know, because then if you can represent something in a diagram, they're more likely to listen to you and pay attention. So as I said, not just graphs or experiments, but actual relationships and so on. Now, Gardner identifies a whole bunch of other things. You might think some of these are less relevant. I've seen raps about statistical material that look to me to be impossibly nerdy, and I wouldn't recommend them at all. But there are these other styles of intelligences to be aware of. I think that the three that I've focused on are the three most important for us. But obviously this, you know, things that come in here are things like body language, you know, interpersonal, the way that you're relating to someone, if you're shutting and closed and don't look up and so on. That's something that's relevant to how well you can communicate as well. So, focusing on the right type can be really important, and just at least being aware of it, that people are going to have different styles of communication, different preferences for the way they learn and understand material. In communication, there's a sort of parallel here in communication, and you see this illustrated all the time. So in personal styles, and I do think being a consultant can accommodate a wide variety of personality types. I don't think it's true that you have to be, you know, an extrovert or the opposite to be a good consultant. There can be a variety of personality styles accommodated successfully. But when we're communicating, we have these sort of contrasts between the kinds of ways that people do communicate. Simplest version of that, I think, is that sometimes when you ask someone a sort of, I don't know, a structural or general question, they will take that seriously on board and attempt to answer it in a kind of academic way. Think, well, I'm being asked this question at a sort of high level, and I need to give a good account of it that's satisfactory academically. Other people will not answer the question at all directly, but tell a little story, tell an anecdote, tell a story about, you know, something that happened 3 years ago, or a patient that they've seen, or an experiment that went wrong or something, and just tell that story. That's the answer to the question. Okay, that's their style. Their style is to think about the particular rather than the universal. Now, Doesn't mean that you can't ignore the university, you might have to come back to it, but being aware that people have these different styles of communication is a good thing to know about. Okay, so let's say we're going to have a session with a client. How do we actually manage it? How does it actually work? Well, ideally, you want to do a little bit of preparation before the session. Sometimes this might be a matter of seconds only. But, you know, depending on your context, you might need to review some information. Okay, so it'd be very common for someone to have sent you something by email to look at beforehand, and that's a good thing to ask for if that hasn't happened, because it can prepare you. So you can't look at something very long, but maybe it's a 2-page document, or maybe it's a journal article, or a consulting report or something like that. Again, depending on your context, you may have to deal with some administrivia, you know, forms, red tape, thinking about putting a client in a database and so on. And I think it is useful to, and depending on the technical depth of what you're likely to do, to go through these steps, to think on what you might be called upon to do in the consulting project, or for that matter in the first session. So this person's coming to talk to me, and they've said they want to talk about propensity scores, or they want to talk about generalized linear mixed models, or they want to talk about the block bootstrap in time series, or whatever. So if it's something where they've actually signaled that, then you might need to prepare for that a little bit more by thinking about, well, when have I done something similar to that? What references do I have? What things could I maybe point them to, so that you're a bit prepared. Oops, I've gone backwards there, sorry about that. Yeah, and thinking about the likely mathematical and statistical issues. This is something that you need to do also as the session progresses, so thinking what the actual mathematical and statistical issues are. A guy who's been big in statistical consulting in the States, Douglas Zahn, he and his mate Bowen wrote a book in the early 1980s, which I think is the only book ever written, and probably likely to be written unless I write one too, on this topic. Its title is The Human Side of Statistical Consulting. Out of print now. But amazingly, it's about what it says it's about. The human side of statistical consulting. What does he mean by that? He means things like dealing with embarrassment when you realise you've made a mistake. What to do when the client bursts into tears. I mean, this kind of thing, you know, just relating to people in a human way. What's actually going on in the human side of statistical consulting? Very little about technical stuff. Anyway, so one of the things he talks about is this needed and wanted conversation. Now, it's not necessarily a conversation that's going to actually occur, but he says you should think about it. Little cross steps here between things that the thing is either needed or not needed, and it's either wanted or not wanted. Well, if the client needs something that you can help them with and they want it, well, that's great, you know, and we can provide it. That's the successful situation. The worst possible situation is when you provide something that is not wanted and not needed. When does that ever happen? Well, you know, you have a flight of fancy about some technique you think is wonderful, and, you know, but doesn't really address the need of the client, and they didn't ask for it in the first place. Okay, that's going to be a disaster. That's terrible. This thing we strike, but not so much commercially, but certainly within the university. So this is when the student comes to us and says, I'm doing this project and I have to do structural equation modelling because my supervisor said so. Now, often that can mean, or at least sometimes it can mean, the supervisor has no idea about statistics, to be honest, but has seen structural equation modelling getting some airplay at a conference somewhere and thinks, oh, my student's got a quantitative study help, you know, that probably means they should use that technique because everybody seems to be talking about it. Something like that. It can be as ill-formed as that. And so that's a worry that we can help with, because we can persuade people that, well, let's just see what your research question is, what's the nature of your data, what you're actually doing, and push them in the direction of giving something they actually need. If you give them something that's needed but not wanted, that's a sort of, it says a danger there. I mean, we want to move it up to here, right? If they really need it, there's an opportunity here. You can express this as an opportunity if you like. So we want to sort of push people in the direction of perceiving that they want something that is actually needed. So getting started. So how do you actually start? Well, as I said, there should be either explicit or implicit agreement on an agenda. Getting information in a non-threatening way as you proceed. That some of the things I've already mentioned, being aware of communication styles and so on. In the first session, it's good to try and deal with the big picture of the project or the need, whatever the client has come to see you about. Make good notes. I'll say more about notes. This is an aside about notes. I think I am pretty good at taking notes now anyway. I'm not sure whether I always was, and probably it's just grueling experience more than any innate skill. But I think it's a really important skill to work at. How can we measure this? Well, it's hard to take notes during sessions, and that's something that is a skill that you need to practice to acquire. Some people don't deal with it that way. They try and listen as much as possible, take brief notes during the session, actually write them up afterwards, write some notes up afterwards. I just find that inefficient. So I try and write furiously and write notes while the session's occurring. But there can be good and bad notes. One test is this first one, that you should be able to look at your notes in 10 years' time, by which, if you're my age anyway, you will have forgotten a lot about the project, and have some understanding of what it was about, to a reasonable degree. You might want to use diagrams for timelines and crucial events. So often there'll be sort of a study that, with any kind of study will often have some kind of timeline. It started here, and then things happened here, and things happened here, and so on. Could be explicit as 3 months, 6 months, 2 years follow-up or whatever, but so that can be drawn out. The crucial things about source of subjects, sample size, and so on. You can't take everything in, so you can't absorb all the technical details, but expanding technical abbreviations, it's quite hilarious how often when you ask the client what EPTL stands for, they either don't know or can't remember themselves. So that's sort of, you should feel free to ask for expansion of technical abbreviations. I do find that clients often are interested in having my notes, which I think is fine. So I'm happy to scan my notes and email them to them. For one thing, it means that I'll have a copy of the notes myself electronically as well as in paper. Okay, so these big picture questions I was talking about before, big picture essentials, what does that mean? Well, these are sorts of things that get covered when statistical literacy is discussed, so that the kind of overall overarching aspects of the study with its needs statistically and some specifics. So what's the source of this research? How did it really get going? Who are the researchers? If you're studying individuals in some sense, how were they selected? Even if it's not like that, how were the data selected? If it's routine administrative data or whatever. What measurements were made? Often you can have quite a lot of discussion here, okay? Because statistically we can make quite a contribution there to the nature of the measurements that were taken, whether they can be improved. Questions asked, setting in which measurements were taken. So this is taken from Jessica Wood's book, Seeing Through Statistics, and she calls it, I think it's this term is due to her, the worry questions. What are the questions we should worry about when we're first finding out about a research project with a view to helping someone statistically or mathematically? Obviously, we should listen carefully. And in particular, it's good to try and sort of suss out why the client's come. Now, the client may have come in an experienced and sensible way, and some clients are like this, particularly clients you see over time, where they're very sort of clear about things. They've got a research study within their own content area. They know that there are statistical aspects of it which are beyond them. They come to you for help with that, and they want to work in a largely collaborative way. And they know the sorts of things they need to tell you. Well, that's all great. That's optimal. And therefore, in those settings, in a sense, that the listening will happen very naturally, and you don't need to focus. But sometimes, focus especially, but sometimes a client will sort of have a bee in their bonnet in their head, and it's good to try and listen to what that is. What's the real thing that's bugging them? Is the real thing that's bugging them, is the sample sizes are imbalanced and someone told them that was a problem? Or someone said the study should have been randomised in the first place and it's not, and what can be done about that? Or they've got missing data in the third wave of the survey but not the fourth wave, or whatever. And so hearing that sort of concern that the client's agitated about is important, and trying to address it is a good thing, right? Because if you actually address something that the client is genuinely concerned about, at least at some level, and don't just say, oh, that's a trivial thing, we'll come to that later. We wouldn't like that if we went to the doctor. If we came to the doctor with our concern and got told, oh, well, I'll solve all these problems, but the reason you've come for me today, we can deal with that, 6 months' time or whatever. We don't feel so good about that. We want to have our concerns addressed. So listen to repeated mention of the question. Okay, what's my role? So what am I really expected to do here? A variety of roles are possible. I could end up being a co-author on a paper with the client. I could be giving just brief advice. I could be doing anything in between those two. Who else is involved? Practical things about communication. How we're going to actually communicate here. Email will be used a lot. And then what will be produced? If it's a project of some substance, what am I actually going to produce at the end of the day? Could be all of these things or some subset of them, verbal advice, email advice, written report, or even a software item or PowerPoint presentation or something. Then we got all the other practical things. What are the deadlines? So there's some negotiation here. Okay, now a lot can happen here. The client may say, well, I have to have it by the end of October, and then in the first week of October, some new information comes to the client, which they pass on to you and say, you've got to take this into account now. Well, now we have some negotiation to do, right? Because the circumstances of the project have changed, and it's reasonable for you to say, well, this is new information, it's going to take more time and so on. So the deadlines can be a movable feast. Working out the financial arrangement's got to be done somehow or other, and you should be reasonably straightforward about that. We're all getting paid here. So the client's getting paid as well for what they're doing. So it's reasonable for there to be some kind of financial compensation often if the person doing the consulting is in a setup where that's what they rely on for revenue for their income. Sometimes you have to think about acceptable or recommended statistical methods and practices. And I've just mentioned a couple of things there. I mean, increasingly in applied science, there's strong emphasis on confidence intervals and not tests, just as a big picture thing. So as professionals, we need to be aware of those trends or recommendations. Sometimes we might be behind them, promoting them ourselves, but certainly we need to be aware of them in their implementation. And sometimes regulatory bodies actually require particular statistical techniques. So the PBAC, the Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee, requires pharmaceutical companies submitting drugs for consideration for the PBAC scheme to use meta-analysis, summaries of the available evidence in their submissions. That's a statistical thing, right? So knowing about that and supporting that is something that we need to be aware of. To deal with intellectual property, I'm not going to talk too much about that, but there may be intellectual property issues that arise, and your institution might want to get involved in negotiating about those as well. Confidentiality and anonymity. So we're getting better at this, but it's still the case that clients can be slacker about that than you'd like them to be, particularly with research on humans. And sometimes we have to ask clients to suitably anonymise data so that we don't get the data ourselves. Expectations, when will I finish? So how do we know that the project's done? Right? You might think that's perfectly obvious when it's done well. It's not. That's not the case. Things can sort of have a long tail and drag on in a slightly uncertain way. Now, I said these all need to be sorted out. Some of them we sorted out implicitly without much explicit negotiation, but they do need to be sorted out. So gathering information, I've talked about communication styles, try to develop a mildly structured approach. So I'm now going to say something about types of questions. This is work based on work by Janice Durr. So she wrote a book called Effective Communication, A Guide to Statistical Consulting. And she's got a lot of stuff there about communication. she discusses 4 types of questions that might be appropriate at different stages in a conversation, and they have different implications for what you get. So a request for information is something particularly that you might use early on because it's very non-threatening and open. It just sort of sets the scene in a general kind of way. What's your study about? Tell me what you're doing. I often start with a question exactly like that. So tell me what you're doing, I might say to a research higher degree student who comes for help. Then we can have an open question that is a little bit more focused. What was the basis for the number of subjects you recruited? How did you, not what was the number of subjects, but what was the basis for the number of subjects you recruited, and so on. Something that's doesn't sound like it has to have a correct, particular answer, but is a little bit more focused. Concrete paraphrase. So this is not a question, but it's a very useful device, I think, to summarise in a specific way what you think you've understood the client to have said, okay? Because that will either elicit confirmation or correction. So this last point here, from what you said, you don't have any missing data, is that right? So that may not have actually very specifically spoken about missing data, but talked about the data in such a way that's led you to conclude that they don't have any missing data. So you've sort of mentally crossed off missing data as an issue. Well, a concrete paraphrase of this sort allows them to say, yeah, that's right, I don't actually. Everybody got followed up. There's at most 1 or 2 missing pieces of data. Or they may say, no, that's not right at all, etc. And then away we go and get that sorted out. So a concrete paraphrase can have a conclusion that you've drawn, either confirmed or corrected. And then we have the closed probing question. But these should not be used straight away. They're important at some point. You need to know whether age was fitted as a factor or as a covariate. There's a sort of thing, yes, no, or quite specific questions. This is when we're getting down into the nitty-gritty. So there's these sort of levels of questioning that can be used. Now, I've said this a number of times, I'll say it again. A lot of people will do a lot of this very naturally. They won't have a classification of questions in their minds, but they'll just talk and they'll successfully get information using these variety of strategies. But, if you've never thought about it or it doesn't come to you very naturally, I think it is useful to see the possibilities. Can move from the specific to the general and vice versa. Occasionally, I've actually logged a sequence in a consulting session. It might have gone for an hour to an hour and a half, and it's quite sort of interesting to look at it and how it may meander. And I think some sort of meandering is perfectly okay. You can move from the general to the specific and back again, but you should be aiming to get the overall statistical picture in such a way that you could describe the study to statistical or mathematical colleagues and hopefully know enough to analyse the data if data analysis is the goal. The goal may be design, which is a different story. But in the middle of the session, I think it's a good idea to identify a specific question and address it. So this is a good strategy because it's comforting to the client. The client wants to know something about, well, how do I really think about the sample size when this is not a standard situation? I can't have the same number in each group, and the formula I get on the web always assume that. So what am I going to do now? Or whatever the specific question is. It's worthwhile addressing that, at least for a bit. Well, here's what I can tell you about that. Here are some references that can be solved in this way. Da, 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 da. If you actually deal with a specific question of a client, that's going to be, well, firstly, directly helpful because it's met a need, but also it'll be reassuring and comforting to the client that they think that you, A, are interested in what they care about, and B, can do something competently about it. Now, if it's a big, difficult question, as I said here, N may be one. You might just deal with one of these specific questions. But sometimes organised clients will come with a list. They'll say, well, here are the questions I want to address, and away you go, have a go at it. Okay, finishing up, the length of the session, well, I mean, my experience, 30 minutes to 2.5 hours. 2.5 hours would be a long one. People get worn out. And clients will often say so. My head is full of too much maths now, or too much, I can't think about this anymore. They'll actually say that, which is kind of good because you may be feeling the same way. Checking conditions, so, worthwhile explicitly saying, well, how much did we get done today of what you were hoping to talk about and hear about from me or discuss? And then, of course, usually be some follow-on. I mean, it's a substantial project. You've only just got started. So if the client wants more in the immediate future, you've got to think about how to address that. Does the client need to do something? Client may need to do something. Client may need to do some data cleaning or further clarification of questions which they thought they'd sorted out, but they haven't really. They don't have a clear research question or questions. And if I've agreed to do something, well, how am I going to do that, when it's going to be done, and so on. And if we've sorted some things out, it's a good idea to document that. That could be done in the notes that you take, or you might write an email immediately after the session. And then you've got practicalities of time and place of next meeting and so on. So that's sort of a summary of the first session, kind of principles and practical ideas about the first session. So for the rest of the time, I want to talk about report writing. And this is something probably that even if you've never done any consulting, you sort of feel like you'd be more comfortable with, right? Because we all do writing of some sort or another, even if it's mainly journal articles. Journal articles, different thing from a consulting report, certainly, but it's still writing. So academics get experience at writing. It's a big part of what we do. Should you write formal reports? Well, I'd make the observation that formal reports are more likely to be preserved than any other material, and I say that to my staff in the Consulting Centre. In 100 years' time, if anybody ever looks at anything about the Consulting Centre, maybe that's too much to hope for. Probably nobody will care in 100 years. But if they do, the only thing that will be considered will be the formal reports that exist, you know, report number, blah, 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 that's on the shelf or whatever, or stored electronically. Anything to do with the commercial arrangements and who it was, you know, details of meetings and all that stuff, that'll be all lost. That'll be archived, shredded, whatever, burnt. But formal reports will be preserved, and that's more generally true. So you're not going to keep, even a good document that you've sent as an attachment to an email is unlikely to be still around in, you know, 50 years. So it does make you think about the usefulness, therefore, of producing formal reports. And of course, because they are formal, they do represent our considered response to a statistical or mathematical need. And so it's where we thought about it carefully. Good to produce them. Represents the quality of your work, as I say. Now, obviously, there's other things that you write, and sometimes a client doesn't want a formal report, or they don't need one at the moment, or, you know, it might come to that, but not yet, and so on. So we can write all sorts of levels of product. They might just want a discussion, don't want anything writing, might want a quick email, right up to anything like an affidavit in a legal setting. If you're writing a formal report, I would say that it's a very good idea to review the brief, what you're supposed to be doing. And sometimes that can be as clear and specific as including the brief in the report. So you might have an introduction and you said the brief for this project was to da-da-da-da. That's really good to have that in your head, right? Because then you are less likely to stray off into other areas that are not addressing the requirements. Good idea to think of who the audience is going to be. It might be only the immediate client. The client may be doing a very confidential report project, and they just want your input, and it's not going to be shown to anyone else. Happens occasionally, not very often. But then it can be anything up to the world, effectively, and often would be. Okay, so why? Because the report is going to be produced to the client. They're going to possibly just put it on the web themselves, or if not, it's going to be referred to in something that they put on the web and included on the web as an, you know, attachment. We're doing this project, da, 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 da. We consulted the University of Melbourne. They produced this report. Here it is on the web. So then the world is the audience. Who else can be the audience? Well, you or your colleagues. So this is where I talk about looking back at things that you've done 15 or 10, 15, 20 years ago. You know, are you going to be able to read it and understand exactly what it was all about sufficiently to reproduce a similar analysis or what have you? This somewhat sobering question of, would I follow what I've written in 10 years' time? Would I follow what I've written in 10 years' time? Well, if you can't follow it in 10 years' time, it's probably not going to do a very good job of communicating now to people who are not you. It should cover a lot of the big picture things. So the nature of the project, these are the kind of worry questions that we went through before. Down the bottom there, I've mentioned reproducibility. So again, if you can follow it sufficiently to be able to to see what analysis was done, up to a point, it should be the case that somebody taking the same data and reading your report should get the same answer if they follow what you say you've done in the report. Now, there can be varying levels of that, but sometimes that's quite specifically needed with source code and so on. So you might do analysis in R or something like that, and the source code is needed to be provided in order to provide that reproducibility. And certainly for analysis purposes and in legal settings, you might want a pretty accurate audit trail of what you've done analytically. Possible structure. Now, the structure of a formal report can vary hugely, and you have headings often that are relevant to the project itself. So I wouldn't suggest that you have, a report that standardly has these headings in the same way that you might in a journal article in applied science or whatever. But these are all things that should be considered to be in there. And sometimes it might be a heading of the report, like recommendations or something. Certainly got to have at the start something about the project and where it came from, circumstances of it being commissioned, the source of the data, the purpose of the report, and so on. The full details of the information that's vital in legal work, as I say, you're required to indicate formally the documents on which you relied and which have been supplied to you. I'm a big fan of writing in formal reports and even less formal reports, a clear introduction that sets out the nature of the project and the report. And some people are sort of, I don't think it's laziness, but some people sort of say, well, do I really have to do this? Everybody knows what the thing's about. I'm just talking to the client. We can just launch straight into it. Okay, but, if, again, in some, it's going to be sent all over the place, potentially. It could be sent to other people around the world, whatever. I just think it's a good idea to have the thing somewhat self-contained. And it doesn't need a lot necessarily to do that. It doesn't need a lot. It can be a paragraph sometimes, or not more than half a page. If you utterly refuse to do that, or you feel like it's just not necessary, I still think it's important to have something like this that I put down the bottom here to, so to speak, trace it or to contextualise the report. Say, well, I'm writing this report assuming that everybody reading it knows all about the project and so on. But it relates to this other report, or it explicitly assumes knowledge of the project and the data. Because then somebody reading that can say, well, I'm not in that boat. Can you help me with that? Can you trace it back? Just a practical thing. Data issues. So this is where there's often a large amount of time, and I think you need to think in a very clear-headed way about this, and it can be difficult to do because the clients don't, by and large, want to think too much about this issue of unclean data or data which needs coding or data which needs wrangling or manipulation. That's not what they come to see you about. They come to see you about your statistical expertise. And the fact that, the long data set has got an entry at row 6,733, which instead of saying 67.4 says, ask Kate. They don't want to know about that. Right. Oh, yeah, that's right. Yeah, sure. You can fix that. Yeah, right, fix it. Okay, well, we can fix it. We know how to deal with that. We have to deal with the realities of data, but that can be time consuming. There's a lot of work potentially in that if clients have not got that straight. Now, the best clients are aware of that, and they'll work hard at getting data in good quality for you and think, beforehand about the kind of data wrangling and manipulation that might be required. But there's often a lot of work here. And I think it's important to document it. So I try and make clear how much work was involved in that. And sometimes it can be as explicit as sort of setting out the processes that you did to do all this sort of cleaning up.
So on data, in my experience, clients usually think their data is way better than it is.
Yeah, that's right.
In fact, I'd go as far as to say, in my experience, I've never seen data that's perfect. It'd be interesting to see whether you have. But in terms of scoping the project, they don't like to think you're going to spend 2 weeks cleaning their data. That's right. And often that's what's needed. That's
my point. That's what I'm saying here. Yeah. So if you can get the data beforehand to at least look at it and flag that there may be a substantial amount of data cleaning involved, all those things that can be necessary. And then as you get it and you're starting to do that, I'd be feeding back to the client and say, well, what we're doing now is this kind of sorting out.
Right. Have you ever seen good data? Have you ever not had to do this at all?
On a small scale, occasionally you get obsessive people who are very good. But yeah, as I say, you're absolutely right. I'm saying it too. That they don't want to know about it. Want to hear. For a start, they're kind of embarrassing, and it's not the main point. It's not what they came to sue you about. It's sort of a, annoying cut on the knee that's in the road of the exercise, so to speak. But it's very important. So, yeah, sometimes we'll have major revisions. Now, clients are generally okay about that. Right? So if they say, it can happen for a variety of reasons, but let's say it's as bizarre as half of the file is misaligned. That has happened in my experience. So, misaligned by rows. So the data is really seriously corrupted because it not the same across the rows, so one's got out by one. Generally speaking, clients are pretty good about a serious error that is their fault in terms of paying for whatever paying for means, and it could mean money, the kind of rework that would be necessary in a case like that. But I think it's good to document what was done. Sometimes we don't want to talk about it either because it's boring to us too. It's sort of, we had to do a lot of it, but it's not really the whole point of the exercise. But I think for educational reasons at least, it's good to document it. So we'll often have a session on data issues and explain that the data is provided in this form and we went through these steps and we identified these kinds of problems and fixed them up in this kind of way and so on. And for business reasons, so it justifies the time that's been taken. Methods, so, we've got to talk about the general requirements, and sooner or later you're going to have to talk about the specifics of methods and the actual techniques that you used. Now, I think it can be quite natural to do that in the body of the report as you go, rather than having a separate method section, but sometimes including a discussion about the nature of the methods that you're using and why you're advocating them in the first place is appropriate. So that's the point I just made. Reproducibility is the test again. So you should have enough description of the methods in order to make it possible for someone following your report to, roughly speaking, do what you did. In the results, that's going to be the main part of the report probably. What do we want to think about here? Well, appendices. Sometimes there is material you should put in an appendix. As academics, we often worry about the quality of what we're producing and thinking, well, I'm a bit uneasy about this, this assumption's not quite right, or the data don't quite fit this model, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, or the data's terrible anyway. But, if we write sentences that amount to this last one here, we won't get too much repeat business, because that's just saying, you're hopeless, your data's hopeless, I've done the best I can, but your data's terrible and can't trust the analysis at all. Now, this is a parody, of course, but you should work with clients as best you can, and there's an educational opportunity there to improve what they do by discussing the nature of what their data are and whether they can improve and so on. Concluding remarks, well, these should relate to the essential purpose of the report. If you have some like this, sometimes it's not necessary. You can just sort of finish the report, but if conclusions shouldn't introduce new material. It's surprising how tempting it is to do that. You write up the report and then you write the conclusions and you think about something that's been on your mind as you've been writing it, and you put in the conclusions something that's not in the body of the report. Not a good idea because it's new, and if you need to refer to it in a substantive way, it should be in the body of the report. Recommendations. So there's pros and cons of this. The client may or may not want recommendations. The most important thing I'd say is that we want to avoid going outside our expertise. Okay, so if we're doing recommendations in a report that's about engineering, we shouldn't be telling the engineers how to build the bridge, so to speak. But sometimes clients value recommendations that are partly a matter of experience judgment. And if that's the case, then you can say so. It's not necessarily something that's come directly out of the work that you've done in the report, but nevertheless could be given if the client says that they value that. appendices I've talked about. I think it, you know, I've seen reports where the report was 15 pages long and there were 400 pages of appendices. I just think that's dumb. You should avoid that, okay? The structure of the report needs to be different in some way if that's the way it looks like it's going to pan out. Of course, a lot of stuff can be supplied electronically in any case. Executive summary, not all reports will have this, but it should be the final thing you write if you do. And a substantial report, like a several hundred page report or whatever, would often have an executive summary. And it has to be the last thing you write because you won't only know what's going to be in it when you finish the report. And that should be really read well. I'd work quite hard on if there's a need for an executive summary, it should be should receive a lot of attention, a lot of care. Practical issues. So graphs, good idea to include some graphs, visual representations, because some people learn that way. Sometimes it'll be very natural to do that because it just requires it. But even if graphs don't occur to you automatically, you might want to consider putting in some sensible and useful graphs. Proofreading. So I don't know what I can say about that. It's been a big thing in my life to try and get the quality of what I write correct. You saw there was a typo here before. It's shameful, but it happens. Ask someone else to read it. You know, some people miss. It's easy to miss something in the very first line of a thing, or even the heading of a report or table or whatever. So getting a colleague to read it through is a good idea. Does the client want something they can edit? Well, that might be a bit alarming to you. And you might ask how you're protected. And there's this thing about the moral rights of an author that you may know about. But look, up to a point, I don't think we are protected. I can guarantee you that a lot of things that I've produced in formal reports have been quoted in who knows what context that I'm not aware of. And you can't control that up to a point. What you can control, of course, is documenting what you provided. So you yourself keep a copy of what you provided. So at least you can say, well, this is the thing that I actually provided. You know, you can provide a PDF used to offer sort of more protection than it does these days. But there may be a whole lot of other things that people actually want. They might want an Excel spreadsheet that allows them to do some what-if stuff in it, or they might want even a shiny app that does something using our PowerPoint slides, source code, something that wouldn't have to be negotiated. Intellectual property issues there, of course. So there's a whole lot of things to negotiate here about what the client actually wants. Providing a report and giving the client the opportunity to respond. Sorry, I've gone over time, I'm nearly finished. Providing a draft first for comment is something that's done, and I think it's okay up to a point. I do try and produce a draft that, from my point of view, is very close to what I would regard as final, or essentially something that could be provided. So don't give them a half-baked report, give them something that's close to what you think should be the final report, which gives them less opportunity to make suggestions for change. But you need to, this opens up a whole ethical can of worms. You know, can you please leave out table 4? What's table 4 about? Why do they need to be left out, etc., etc. These issues are not going to be clear cut. But if there is any kind of iteration along these lines, it's a good idea to resolve them quickly and provide the final report. Last slide, I'm going to finish here. So there is other writing that we do, as I mentioned before, and I think it's a good policy to try and get be reasonably careful in all that we write and thoughtful about what we say. So I've seen situations where people have become unstuck in legal settings by seeming to take sides when they were required to be impartial and a servant of the court only. So that's an example. So, I mean, just be careful in what you write generally. I think statisticians and mathematicians are going to be taken seriously. And this is sort of a little tip, I think, to listen to these internal voices. I said, I mean, you're in your own mind. If you're writing something you think, oh, you know, I think that's right, or I had that opinion or whatever, just asking yourself, is that really true? And can I substantiate it in some way? Or can I say that it's my considered opinion? Is a worthwhile voice to pay attention to, worthwhile question to pay attention to. And if you're not being thorough, then say so and say what the implications of that are. So this is sort of a cautionary tale, I guess, about, in general, writing material in a consulting context, and the suggestion of keeping it somewhat formal, even if it's not actually a formal report. Okay, so that's me. I've gone over time, I'm sorry, but I'll finish there, so that's the end.
So thanks, Ian. As Ian indicated, we have actually reached 11 o'clock. I believe we've got this room. Are you available for questions if anyone's got any? Ian? So if anyone needs to leave, either electronically or in real life, feel free. But if anyone wants to ask questions, either electronically in real life, Ian's available. So does anyone want to ask anything? Kate?
Sorry, Ian, I missed the very beginning, so hopefully you didn't cover this. You talked a lot about what you do when you have the client and how to manage that relationship. How do I go about finding the client?
Yeah.
And
No, I didn't talk about that. And I've been in a situation where, a privileged situation, I suppose, at the University of Melbourne, because we sort of have a steady stream of clients, and the consulting centre's been going for a long time. So I and the centre haven't had to do a lot by way of marketing the centre. Of course, we do have, we've got various ways that we actually market the centre, websites and Facebook and all that kind of stuff. But we haven't had too much of sort of actively going out to organisations and asking to see their scientific directors and that kind of thing. We get a lot of work from word of mouth anyway. So we see clients in a particular area, and then other organisations that haven't used us before hear about the work that we do for client X and client Y, what's on their door, etc. So yeah, I don't want to say too much about that because I don't know that I've got the right kind of experience to help with that in terms of drumming up business. But if you had particular expertise in an area, then there would be some common sense things to think about. Who needs my expertise? What organisations use my expertise? Networking at conferences along those lines. But you will have thought of all those things, I'm sure. Yeah.
I have can I ask a question?
Yeah, come on.
Do you have to worry about insurance?
Yeah, yes, you do. Yes, you do. So in the uni, again, we're sort of in a fortunate situation. The Statistical Consulting Centre is part of the University of Melbourne, and the activity we do in that sense is on behalf of the University of Melbourne, and the university has indemnity insurance that covers the work that we do as university employees. More generally, you need professional indemnity insurance, and there are organisations that offer that. Just got to pay a premium and get the insurance if you're doing it privately or even as a small business.
Are there any questions from any of them? No.
Yep. Ian, hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Hey, this is Nick Tierney. Hey, just wondering if you are going to make your slides available somewhere.
Yeah, I can. Is that Nick, is it?
Yes.
Oh, good day, Nick. Sorry, I couldn't see you properly and I recognise your voice. Yes, that's okay. Yeah, in this case, that's okay.
Okay, great. Yeah, I really enjoyed this talk, and there was just heaps of really good information. I also particularly like the references, particularly since some of those books are out of print. I think that they're, sure. That's really useful.
They're not all, some of them might be available in libraries. I'd be happy to provide more references too. I could do that afterwards if that's something that can be distributed, Peter.
Yeah, that'd be great. Yep.
The whole session's going to be published on the ACEMS website.
That's right. Yep.
So at least you'll be able to see the slides, not in quite a neat form, but anyone can look at this on the ACEMS website anyway.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. And thanks, Ian.
But I will specifically produce a list of references. I'm happy to do that.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Any other questions?
I got one.
Tim.
So, my question is, how do you know that you're qualified to consult? Like, how much specific knowledge do you need? Do you have to be an expert in the area and familiar with all these different types of things, or how much can you rely on just an analytical mind? balance?
Yeah, so that's a good question, because for one thing, we don't quite have in statistics, or I guess in mathematics, the same thing as you do in other professions, where you can point to a quite specific formal qualification, like medicine being the best example, I guess, but also engineering and accounting and what have you. In statistics, there is the Statistical Society of Australia, and other professional bodies do offer accreditation. So, as you're probably aware, there's in statistics, there's the accreditation system of the Stat Society, which has either graduate statistician or accredited statistician. And they do have some status. So there's been some situations in government where a particular statistical procedure has to be done by someone with an A-stat, with an accredited statistician status. But leaving that aside, it's true that anybody can, so to speak, put up their shingle and say, I'm offering, statistical consulting to the gentry or whatever, to all and sundry. So I mean, so that means it's hard for me to know how to answer that question. I'm in a setting where, up to a point, we have to be a generalist, but I will sometimes say that is just outside my expertise, and I don't want to do it. I can't do it, and I don't want to do it. I might refer it to someone else who's more capable in that particular area. So I guess it's a matter of assessing, certainly when you're starting out, it's a matter of sussing out the level of expertise required in a particular project as best you can before you take it on. That's the way I think about that, and gradually getting more experience. But also, well, maybe because I'm a curious person, also I think if you like doing it, pushing yourself a bit, going outside your comfort zone a bit, taking on something that's not perhaps quite something you've looked at in detail before, but with some help from mentors or references, etc. So as you develop more confidence, you can start to look at things that you haven't had a lot of experience with.
So if you're doing legal work, you do actually have to have a list of you and who you are and your qualifications, don't you?
Yeah, well, the legal work, they'll always want a CV, and the lawyers will want to be sure that you have the relevant expertise and that you don't stray outside of it. And that can be probed. I haven't had that experience myself, but I've been in legal disputes where experts on the other side have had their expertise challenged. And, they may have a PhD, but it can still be a challenge. But, well, hang on, what a sec, you say you've got a PhD, but do you really have expertise in mathematical statistics? You've got a PhD in, I don't know, urban geography or something that uses statistics, So, yeah, the lawyers will scrutinise the CV. And sometimes I have had the situation, I'm sort of half forgetting this, where I've been asked about consulting centre reports that I've done that are listed in my CV. And I can't remember what they're about. I mean, they're 17 years ago, and the title's there. I can't remember anything about it, really, to be honest.
That's another good reason to be able to understand them 10 years
I know, but yeah, I can probably read it, I'll be all right. But just seeing the list with the titles is embarrassing because there's several hundred of them now. So, yeah, anyway.
You're not allowed to ask the lawyer whether he can remember a case 17 years ago.
Well, that's right. Yeah.
Finally, any other questions from any of the other remote nodes here? Okay. Well, Jason. Yeah.
There's an opportunity cost in taking on something.
Sure, absolutely.
Recognising when something might not actually be a good consultancy, that you might not be able to satisfy the client's objectives, or that what they're asking for is unreasonable. Or it's like the table where you had what's needed, it might not be wanted. I had that experience, and it did cause that a very short-lived relationship with that client, and that cost me other work that I'd passed up to take on consultancy. Do you have any tips on sort of recognising? Not
really. Only trying to work that out as early as you can is all I'd say. So, I mean, I guess you develop antennae about that. And, your experience there was likely to make it less likely it'll happen in the future, or you'd be better at doing, you know what I mean? So, a lot of these things you do learn by experience. But I would say trying to ascertain whether you can help in a good way and whether it's going to be a successful thing as early as possible. But look, if you've worked as much as I have, everybody's going to have disasters occasionally. You can't avoid it. You know, client seems really pleasant and well organised, and the opposite turns out to be the case on both fronts. They're actually unpleasant, obnoxious, and disorganised. You know, and it takes you a month of working with them to find that out. So I mean, you know, it's human interactions happening here. So occasionally it can't be avoided. But I try and think of those issues as early as possible, and if necessary, nip it in the bud early. So say, oh, look, I just don't think this is going to be a successful interaction. If you don't mind, I'll withdraw now.
Okay. Well, Ian, I found that fascinating, and I'm sure that everyone else did. So on behalf of all of us, I'd like to thank you for your efforts.